Hello, and welcome to Stream of Conscience, the show that celebrates local activism and is brought to you by Democracy for America, Fairfield County, a grassroots political organization that is always looking for new members. I'm your host, John Hartwell. Today's show, we have Kim Fawcett, the state representative from the District 133, primarily in Fairfield, but also a bit of Westport. Kim actually happens to be my state rep.
I do.
And the first time you ran in 2006, I was your treasurer.
Yes, you were. You were lucky to get roped in, right?
I was lucky that you won and that it was such an easy job. So we're going to talk today about the state budget and about what Kim does in the state legislature up in Hartford, where she is the chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation, which is a huge job and very important to us here in Fairfield County. And she also this year is vice chair of the Children's Committee, which is a new committee for her, and it's a leadership role at the same time. So she's very involved, and we're very happy to have you.
Well, thank you for having me.
So the budget.
Yes.
You guys passed a budget that had, at the time, a $2 billion hole in it. You knew that going in. That was part of the negotiations with the Governor Malloy's administration, and the governor said that he was going to fill that hole. Then he had negotiations with the state employees unions, and the negotiations settlement came up with $1.6 billion in cuts. And that is now in the process of going through the approval with the various state unions. And today is, by the way, Thursday, the 23rd of June. And the reason why that's important is because the unions are just finishing their voting. And at the moment, it looks like they may not, in fact, approve that budget deal. In which case, if at the end of the day it's not approved, then the budget comes back to the General Assembly in a special session, and you have to find at least $1.6 billion in cuts. I'll say that the other $400 million, there have been increased revenues, and the Malloy administration said that they could cover that without asking for more tax increases or cuts. So it's $1.6 billion on the table if the unions, at the end of the day, don't approve the deal.
Right.
So where are you on all of this?
Well, I think I told you before we started shooting that I am an internal optimist and really feel like I'm not willing to give up yet on the process that the unions are going through. It looks like that they may be turned down in this first round of voting, but they've got a process in place where they can clarify some of the language of the deals that are in place, the concession deals, and then go back and re-vote. I am just keeping my fingers crossed and staying positive that those deals are going to come through, and that $1.6 billion is going to be part of the budget. Without it, obviously, we have a very, very different scenario in Connecticut.
Right. So let's just talk a little bit about the lead up to the budget deal. Where did you stand on the budget that was passed?
Right. I obviously, my constituents know by now, and a lot of people have talked to me, I was one of a handful of Democrats that did decide to vote no on the budget. I think it's important for full transparency. I was disappointed with some key aspects of how we brought the budget together. And I think the most important part of that process was that I had told people last year, and really even several years ago, when the economy started to go over a cliff and we knew that we were going to have very severe budget problems in Connecticut, I always had said, I think before you go to the conversation about revenues, before you even go there, you have to have a very serious conversation about cuts.
Right.
And you have to look through your budget and put a spotlight on what you spend money on and ask very critical questions about, is this a priority of government? Do we need to spend this money? Can we live without it? Can we spend it smarter? And so at the end of the day, you make a whole round of very serious cuts before you engage the conversation about revenue increases. I didn't feel like that was the process we had this year. I was really surprised that that wasn't the process we had. I felt like the emphasis was on the tax package. I do understand philosophically what our leaders in Hartford were trying to accomplish, but the tax package was really hard for me. combined with the fact that we didn't have a serious conversation about finding those cuts.
So if you had been leading a serious conversation about cuts, outline some of the areas that you would have been interested in seeing us take a look at.
You know, everyone says that to me, oh, what can you cut? And I started through the session to keep a list. There are specific things you can always cut. The problem is, anytime you bring up one specific issue, there's always a group of people who say this is really important to me. Of course. We have
That's
a
how it
horse
got there
guard.
In the first place.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
We have a horse guard in Connecticut.
Right.
Is the horse guard a critical function to government in the state? Maybe not, but it's really important to some communities.
Sure.
We have some library programs here in Westport. Funding for our libraries is really important to some people, and some would argue critical to the state, but others would say not.
But
and
you're
so
not going to find $1 billion or $2 billion in the horse guard or the library.
No. I think we did. There's a group of moderate Democrats, and we worked pretty hard the past 3 years to sift through as best we could. And we think there's between 300 and 400 million of those types of cuts. So we have a list. We've presented it to leadership. It's a pretty public list. A lot of it was on the governor's list that you talked about, that they put out a few months ago.
Right, which we covered a bit with Jonathan
That's
Steinberg
right.
a couple of weeks ago.
A lot of those cuts were ones that we had identified. They're difficult cuts, but they're not the type of cuts that decimate government or get to that point where you're removing the critical role of government.
So just give me 2 or 3 that are large enough to make a dent in the budget, because $300 or $400 million is a good number. If you're making it up $10 million at a time, that's a lot of little pieces you got to hit. Where are we? Are there any large chunks?
No. I mean, the chunks are, 2 million, 5 million, maybe a few 10 millions. But that's if you don't talk about cutting aid to towns, right? If you want to hold your towns harmless. We had a serious conversation this year about closing rest areas, not service areas, not where you stop when you're driving along the highway and you get gas or you go in and get food and use the bathroom.
Right.
We actually own in Connecticut 7 rest areas. They're really just a place to pull off, and they've got picnic tables.
Right.
They produce no revenue. They cost us about $3 million a year to run. And over the next 5 years, in order to keep them open, we have to spend $15 million because they are in such disrepair.
Right.
So, why would we keep them open and invest that $15 million when we can close the buildings? You could still leave the parking lot open so that the trucks could park, but it's just, is that a critical role to Connecticut? And those are the types of questions we need to ask.
And on the revenue side, clearly we did. There are a lot of things that happened in the revenue. The sales tax got increased. The marginal tax rates on income tax got increased. There were lots and lots of fees put in place or increased that hadn't been before. Give me your, how did you feel about that, and what would you have done differently if you...
Again, it comes back to what I said in the beginning. The conversation needed to be about cuts first, so that we slimmed down government to where we as Democrats thought was, a slimmed down government, but we weren't going to touch critical services. And then you have the conversation about revenues. And if we had done that, the conversation about revenues wouldn't have been a $1.5 billion revenue package. It probably would have been less than $1 billion. There just would have been a
still
smaller
a large
need.
number.
It's a large number.
Yeah.
I was pleased, if you want to put a positive spin on the revenue package. I worked really hard with some constituency groups from Fairfield and Westport, and we were able to go in and speak very loudly against the proposed taxes on boats, marinas, and airplanes. And while I am not a boater or a plane person, the arguments on paper financially for what those taxes would have done to those industries were compelling. And we were able to bring those compelling arguments to our leadership. And it was so clear that we actually got all of those taxes taken out of the tax package, because you could very clearly see the damage it was going to do to those industries and the jobs that were going to be lost when those industries were damaged. So there really were very serious conversations about these revenue asks, and there were people who were trying hard to be thoughtful about
And
taxes.
if you were talking to a citizen saying, how can that person get involved? How can they make a difference? Because down here in Fairfield County, a lot of people look at Hartford as another world and not a very friendly one. And we tend to see ourselves as being the ATM, and Hartford is, pushing the buttons. So you've just talked about a very specific example of where a tax was put on the table that impacted your constituents, and you were able to get it taken back. So
that's right.
How does that process work for people?
I think that's the most interesting part of this job. For 5 going on 6 years now, I've used constantly this phrase that I'm your voice, that I hear from the people that matter to me, and then I use my voice up in Hartford. And that is, sort of the foundation, or the sort of the center of how I do this job. And it's such an important message for people across this country of this amazing democracy. We have this amazing opportunity to impact our government. But people like me who are elected in the government, unless you take the time to pick up the phone and call me or email me, if you don't tell me what matters to you, I don't know. And so I always emphasize to people, I am very eager to be your advocate. You've hired me to fight for you, but I don't know what to fight for unless you tell me. So I am very, I just always urge people to take seriously the responsibility they have, that if they want their government to reflect their concerns, they have to pick up the phone. They have to write an email to their member of Congress or their state rep or their local, Board of Education member. You have to reach out and let people know what you think.
Okay. So one of the issues that is very important to people here in Fairfield County, obviously, is transportation.
Yes.
And you are the chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee for Transportation. So all transportation spending comes at least at one point through your committee,
right?
And then obviously goes up to the larger Appropriations Committee and to the House as a whole. And so you don't have the final say, but you're certainly a very important person, a very important player in the process. So what's happening with transportation funding and spending? What do you see going on?
I think it starts with the governor that we elected last year. I think it's important for people to know that this governor, coming from Fairfield County, really understands the importance of our transportation infrastructure. Our transportation infrastructure is the backbone of our economy.
Sure.
It is how goods move, it is how people move, and if we have a broken transportation infrastructure, which many people think we do have, it's a disservice to all levels of our community. So, I would say part of his overall budget philosophy was, there's a pillar of transportation investment in there. He has basically said one pillar of his philosophy is we're going to restructure long-term debt. That's the conversation he's having with the unions. Another part of his philosophy has been we're going to not necessarily cut back spending, but rein in spending, halt government from growing. And that's important because basically what he's saying is we're trying not to lay off thousands of people and add to unemployment. But the other pillar of his long-term strategy for Connecticut is a massive investment in our transportation infrastructure. And
what will that look like? What's that massive? Where's the money going to go?
Well, I think we are poised to see him, get more serious about it. What in Connecticut, the conversation that is happening is an investment in mass transportation. So our trains and our buses as sort of the spine or the backbone of our transportation infrastructure. And the plan is not just to move people, but to create transit-oriented development or dense districts around our mass transit centers, so that over time in cities like Stamford and Bridgeport, you create zones that are near mass transportation that provide a lot of opportunity for business growth and residential living. And when you do that, when you put policies in place that incentivize transit-oriented development, it's better for the environment. It helps people and goods get to places, and it's it's a 21st century sort of approach to
So you have a
transportation.
new train station that's going to open up in Fairfield.
Yes, we do.
Fairfield Metro, I think they're calling it.
Yes, we do. We're very excited.
Yeah. So what's that going to do for parking, for transit-oriented development for people in Fairfield County?
Right. There's a long-term plan there. It's a beautiful long-term plan. I think over the next 5 to 10 years, the people of the region, but certainly in the town of Fairfield, are going to see that corner of our town just transformed. The first step will be hopefully opening the train station later this year. If you drive by now, it looks very close to being ready. There will be 1,500 parking places, which is a huge amount of parking places, more than Fairfield County has seen in decades. And that'll be the first stage. And then the second stage involves 4 office buildings, a high-rise hotel, a big fitness center. There's several walking paths. There's proposed condos and apartments. And so what you start to see, and a lot of retail space. And so what you start to see develop is a place where people can live and go for entertainment and their transportation center. So I think over the next 5 to 10 years, that region will turn into exactly the type of transit-oriented development, what we call smart growth center.
Right. Good. I want to switch to the children's issues you've got because, as I said earlier, you just this is your first year on the Children's Committee, and you came in as the vice chair.
Right.
Which I think is pretty interesting. Obviously, the leadership in the House has looking to you as someone that they want to grow and develop. And so I know that you've got 3 children of your own.
That's right.
And they're all in the public schools in Fairfield. And children have been very important to you and throughout your career. So talk to me about what's going on in the Children's Committee and what do you want to do with it?
Yeah, it's not an issue that I gravitated to early on because I thought, well, I'm that sort of naturally I connect with children because I have 3 kids of my own. But it turns out that because I have 3 kids of my own, because that's the demographic that I am, I'm drawn to those issues because issues that impact children have more personal meaning to me. And it turns out that in the legislature, there's not a lot of moms with school-age children elected.
Interesting.
We're sort of there's not many of us, a handful, maybe, 3 or 5 of us that actually have school-age children. Lots of dads, but not a lot of moms.
Not a lot of moms. Okay.
What is interesting to me is moms who want to get involved in politics tend to wait till their kids go to college. So I have a number of colleagues women whose children are grown.
Sure.
But that being said, this year was a great year. If you are an activist or an advocate for children's issues in Connecticut, there was incredible, almost behind the scenes, but public progress made for our children at many levels. Certainly, there was our governor and the leaders in the legislature took a very big stand and said, we're going to fully fund education. There's going to be cuts, there might be restraints, but we are going to work really hard to keep education intact. And
which is, by the way, the most, by far the largest piece of the money that comes from the state back to the towns.
Absolutely, and I think so important for people to realize that and I say this often, but in Fairfield and Westport, we get $3 or $4 or $5 million a year of our $150 million budgets from the state of Connecticut. It doesn't seem like critical money to our towns. Certainly we wouldn't want to cut that money from our budgets. But when you look at an urban center like Stamford or Norwalk or certainly Bridgeport, where I'm more active with nonprofits, they get, $50 million of their money, $60, $70 million, a huge percentage of their budget. So when at the state level we make reductions in spending on education, the impact on our urban centers is devastating.
Right.
And so, because this year we took a stand, our governor took a stand and said we're going to protect that funding, he's taking a very big stand for our inner city kids and protecting their education, which is still floundering. But the state did its part.
So what kind of issues did you deal with in the Children's Committee?
Sure. There's a number of legislative initiatives that passed this year. The first one is it's exciting for parents with special needs kids.
Mm-hmm.
We passed some legislation this year that helps children with autism, and it just guarantees that the teachers that are working with them are certified. Believe it or not, that was not a requirement in the past. And now teachers that want to work with children with autism do have to sort of have special training and set special certification. So that was a big accomplishment for our special education, special needs families this year.
You're doing things with kids here locally.
Yes.
I think it's quite fun.
Yeah, I realized when I got elected 5 years ago that many state representatives host shows like this. So, most of my colleagues will host a political talk show like you're doing today. And I thought, well, that's kind of fun, but I wanted a different spin on it. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if someone like me hosted a political talk show, but instead of interviewing adults or politicians or local leaders, I interviewed kids. So I started a show called Kids Who Care. It's a current issues talk show for our kids.
Nice.
And we have about 7 or 8 episodes. It's a lot of work, as you know, from coming here today.
I do.
And coordinating the parents and the kids and helping the kids prepare for the talk show. But the kids pick their issues. I work with them sometimes several weeks before we film, and they do the research. But the kids come on as the experts.
Nice.
On whatever issue of the day that we're discussing.
So they choose the issue.
They choose the issue.
And they are the experts.
They are the experts. I'm the interviewer.
Nice.
And hopefully coaching them through it. But we, like I said, do a lot of talking beforehand so that they are going to websites and they are reading up on the issue, and it's amazing the stuff they find and they bring to me.
And when I think back and think about what we did as children in school compared to what our kids have done,
right?
It's so different. They do so much more now. It's really amazing. We're almost out of time. I mentioned at the top of the show that you have mostly Fairfield constituents, yes, and a few here in Westport. The Greens Farm.
Very important community.
Very important,
yeah.
Obviously. Very important, the Greens Farm section of Westport. We're approaching redistricting because of the census in 2010, and then we redistrict in 2011.
Right.
And the question is, what do you think is going to happen to your district, and how do you are you involved in that? Do you have any sort of input? What goes on there?
Yes, I do have a little bit of input, but definitely not final say. In Connecticut, we're a really unique state. Most states, the political party that is the majority party in the legislature dictates and dominates the redistricting party. So if the Democrats are in charge, they write the lines, and that's just the way it is. And that's most states in the country.
But that's not Connecticut.
Not Connecticut.
Right.
We have a history of having a bipartisan process. The Democrats and the Republicans appoint committees, and the lines are redrawn, and everybody has to agree.
Right.
So it's a lot of give and take.
Right.
So
the actual mechanics of that in the legislature is that the bill has to pass with a 2/3 majority in both houses, and the Republicans can block in either house. So they have veto power, which means that they have equal say at the table.
Right. If you look at a map of the state of Connecticut, my district wins first prize for being the most gerrymandered district.
You think so?
Everybody agrees.
Okay.
It sort of looks like a giant snake on a map.
Right.
And I happen to live at the tail end of one of the snakes. So it's...
And I'm at the tail end.
And you are at the other end, right?
Yeah.
So, I am going to see changes to my district.
Sure.
But I was able to go in and say, I really like representing Westport. If I could keep Westport, I put in a request to keep Westport.
Okay.
But that being said, because of where I lived and because there's this negotiation between Republicans and Democrats that takes place, there's not really a guarantee they can give me. They're going to try their best to create a district that is around my residence that represents, helps me, represent Fairfield and hopefully Westport.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out, and it has to be finished by the middle of September.
That's right.
Because next year's elections will depend on it.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, Kim, thank you so much for coming in today.
You
really
are so
enjoyed
welcome.
it. And, look forward to having you back again. talk.
Anytime, John.
Yeah. I have to figure out what's happening with his budget.
Yeah, maybe we'll be back in like a month to talk about the new round of cuts.
It's very possible. Wow. Thanks again.
You're so welcome.
Here's Anne Galloway with our Stream of Conscience book review, Aftershock by Robert Reich.
Complicated economic theories often make my eyes glaze over, but Aftershock by Robert Reich is eminently readable. In this book, Reich effectively links economic issues to the culture as a whole. Its major premise is that an implied social contract between employers and workers has been broken, and as a result, our society has lost a balance between the haves and the have-nots. Reich described similarities between the Great Depression of the 30s and our recession of the past 3 years. The Depression was characterized by widening inequality with vast accumulations of income by the wealthiest, taking purchasing power away from everyone else. The share of income going to the richest 1% of Americans peaked in 1928 at over 23%. It reached that same number in 2007. The wealthy tend to save or invest their money, thus depriving our economy of spending that otherwise could support business growth. Reich says that if income distribution gets too far out of whack, the economy should be reorganized to ensure that average citizens have enough purchasing power. During the Depression, the Roosevelt administration put workers' protections in place: minimum wage, the 40-hour work week, the right to join labor unions, better working conditions, health and pension benefits. In 1933, financial regulations were imposed on banking and the stock market. But in 1999, Wall Street's deregulation turned finance into the master rather than the servant of American industry. And the short-term profits began to trump long-term growth. Finance became the fastest growing part of the economy, and Wall Street acquired greater influence in making the rules of the economic game. The result? More wealth and reduced taxes for the rich, union busting, reduced corporate payrolls, and benefits for everyone else. Large employers also moved their operations overseas, laying off American workers and hiring cheap foreign labor. This did lower production costs and produce cheap goods, but it left unemployed workers in the U.S. with no purchasing power, increased personal debt and borrowing. Reich asked, why did we fail to raise taxes on the rich and fail to cut them for poorer Americans? Why didn't we threaten the loss of U.S. citizenship to anyone keeping his money abroad to escape U.S. taxes? America could have expanded investments in R&D and required corporations that commercialize such investments to create new jobs in the U.S. We could have insisted that foreign trading partners establish a minimum wage so that all workers could share in the gains from global trade. Reich lists several reforms to transform the economy: a reverse income tax, a re-employment system, school vouchers based on family income, college loans linked to subsequent earnings, Medicare for all, free access to transportation, parks, museums, and libraries, improvements in education, cutting carbon emissions, and getting money out of politics. Inequality poses two threats. The first is economic. The other is political. Widening inequality, coupled with the perception that big business and Wall Street are in cahoots with big government to make the rich even richer, encourages extremists who gain power by turning the public's economic anxieties into resentments against particular individuals and groups. Reich asks, how much inequality can be tolerated? When bets go sour and the economy nosedives, who gets bailed out and who are left to fend for themselves? At what point does an economy imperil itself politically as large numbers conclude that the game is rigged? This has been a Stream of Conscious book review. I'm Anne Galloway. Thanks for watching.